The drawing room at Ravensmere held 40 guests, and not one of them would meet her eyes. Cassandra Vane stood at the long windows, with her back very straight and her gloved hands folded, and the room arranged itself around her absence as though she were a draught no one wished to acknowledge. They had come for the autumn assembly that her late father had founded, and they ate his food and drank his wine and spoke of his daughter, in the low, careful voices people use for things they fear. She was 23, dressed in dove gray because half-mourning suited a woman whose father had been buried only 11 months, and she had grown used to the particular silence that opened ahead of her, wherever she walked. A footman approached with a tray and stopped 2 steps short, uncertain whether she might wish to refuse it cruelly. As the daughter of the late Duke of Ravensmere was said to do, she took a glass she did not want to spare him. That was the kind of thing no one ever saw. The footman's gratitude was a flicker there and gone, a small loosening of his shoulders as he moved away, and Cassandra filed it among the other things she had learned never to expect thanks for. She had spent the evening so far in this manner, performing 100 tiny mercies that looked, from any distance at all, like nothing. She had stepped aside so a dowager might have the warmer seat. She had declined to correct a young man who had called her by the wrong title, sparing him the embarrassment, and watched him walk away believing her too proud to have noticed. The room read her stillness as disdain. It had always read her stillness as disdain. She had stopped, years ago, trying to teach it otherwise. What the county saw was a different woman entirely. The county saw the temper that had supposedly driven 3 suitors from the house in a single season, the sharp tongue that had reduced a vicar to stammering, the cold pride of a girl raised by a man too grieved by his wife's death to soften her. They had a word for her, passed hand to hand at every dinner table within 30 miles. And that night, Lady Henthorne used it behind a fan she had not lowered quite far enough. "The Dragon of Ravensmere," she said to the woman beside her. And the woman laughed the small laugh of someone agreeing with power. Cassandra heard it. She had been meant to hear it. She turned her face to the dark glass and watched her own reflection refuse to flinch, and only her breath, gone shallow and quick beneath the gray silk, betrayed that the word had landed where words were meant to land. You may think you already know this woman. Stay with her a little while. The room had decided who she was years ago, and the room had never once asked her a question whose answer it did not already believe. The truth, which no one in that drawing room wanted, was simpler and harder than the legend. Cassandra Vane had learned coldness the way other people learned needlework, by long practice and under instruction. Her mother had died bearing her, and the great house had folded its grief into a kind of discipline so total that warmth itself came to seem like a fault of character. Her father had loved her, in his way, the way a man loves a fortress he has built against further loss, and he had taught her that to be a Vane was to need nothing, and to ask for nothing, and to give the world no soft place where it might wound her. She had been an apt pupil. She had been so apt that she had forgotten, somewhere in the long apprenticeship, that the armor was a thing she wore and not a thing she was. By the time her father lay dying and reached for her hand and found he did not know how to hold it, she had already become the dragon the county named her, and she had not the smallest notion of how a person might become anything else. She could remember, if she let herself, the precise quality of the house in those last days, the hush of the sick room, the doctor's careful boots on the stair. Her own hand laid over her father's on the counterpane, both of them stiff with the unfamiliarity of it. 2 people who had loved each other in the only currency they possessed, which was duty, and who discovered at the end that duty made a very poor language for goodbye. He had tried to say something to her on the last afternoon, and he had got as far as her name, Cassandra, and then her name a second time, softer, and then the fever had taken the words before they came, and she had sat there holding a hand that no longer knew her and understood that whatever he had wished to give her would now never be given. She had not wept at the funeral. The county had marked that too and added it to the ledger. It kept against her, and she had let it, because the alternative was to explain that a person who has never been permitted to weep does not learn the trick of it merely because the occasion at last requires it. The estate had passed to her, which was the scandal beneath the scandal. There was a cousin, Mr. Brust, Aldous Pennard, who had expected the whole of it, and received a single farm and a grievance the size of a county. And there was a great deal of unspoken agreement among the better families that a woman alone should not hold so much, and ought, for the good of everyone, to be married into safer hands, as quickly as decency allowed. Lady Henthorne had taken up this cause as her own. She had a son, a pleasant, vacant young man named Crispin, and she had decided that the dragon's lands would do very nicely for him, dragon attached or not. And she had spent the better part of the autumn explaining to anyone who would listen that the poor motherless creature simply needed a firm and guiding influence. The county found this charitable. Cassandra found it the way one finds a draft beneath a door in January, a small, cold pressure that never quite let her forget it was there. Into this, with the rain coming sideways off the moor and the assembly half spent, came a man no one had invited. She noticed him because the room noticed him, and the room noticed him because he did not seem to know that he ought to behave as though she were not present. He stood near the doors with rainwater, darkening the shoulders of a plain, dark coat, a tall man with the weathered look of someone who had spent years in harder weather than England offered. And when Lady Henthorne's word drifted toward him on the warm, crowded air, he turned his head and looked at Cassandra directly. Without apology and without the careful, sliding glance everyone else employed, his face was not handsome in the way the county prized. It was a face that had been broken somewhere and set somewhat wrong, a faint scar through the left brow, a jaw that had learned to hold itself against pain, and eyes of so dark a gray they seemed nearly black in the candlelight. He looked at her as one looks at a person, and Cassandra, who had not been looked at as a person in longer than she could measure, felt something in her chest perform a motion it had no business performing. His name, she learned within the hour because the room could speak of nothing else, was Captain Nathaniel Crewe, lately of the merchant fleets, more lately still the new tenant of the old Aldermore lodge that bordered her northern wood. He had taken the lease sight unseen, and arrived with 2 trunks and no introductions. And the county had not decided yet whether he was a gentleman or merely dressed as one. He had come to the assembly, it was said, on the strength of a card sent to the previous tenant and never withdrawn, which made him either a man ignorant of the rules or a man indifferent to them, and Cassandra could not tell which, and found to her irritation that she wished very much to know. She did not approach him. A dragon did not approach. She let the evening carry her toward the card-room where the older women sat, and she was nearly past him when Lady Henthorne, emboldened by wine and by an audience, said it again, louder, in the open this time, so that it was less a remark than a performance. "There stands the dragon of Ravensmere," she said, "who frightened off every honest man in the county, and will frighten off this one too, mark me." The little crowd around her tittered. Crispin looked at his shoes. And Cassandra, who had spent 11 months learning to let such things pass over her like weather, felt the old hot shame rise in her throat and turned to leave before it could show on her face. It was the stranger who spoke. He had not been addressed. He had no standing in the matter at all. Yet he set down his glass and said, in a voice pitched low and perfectly clear, that he had crossed 3 oceans and met a great many frightening things, and that a woman who declined to be charming for the entertainment of people who had never been kind to her was not among them. The room went very still. Lady Henthorne's fan stopped its motion, and Captain Crewe looked at Cassandra and added more quietly that no one in the room had asked her a single question all evening, and that he found himself curious what she might say if anyone did. No one had ever defended her. That was the thing she could not arrange her face around. People had pitied her, and people had feared her, and a great many people had wanted things from her, but no one in 23 years had simply stood in a crowded room and told it that it was wrong about her. She heard the word "no" aimed, not at her, but on her behalf. "No, you will not do this in front of me." And it struck somewhere very old and very guarded, and for one terrible instant she felt her eyes sting. She mastered it. She inclined her head a precise half-inch. The coldest courtesy in her considerable arsenal, and she said that the captain was generous to a woman he did not know, and that he would learn, as the county head, why such generosity was unwise. Then she left the room with her spine straight and her breath ruined, and the strange warm wreckage of his sentence following her out into the rain. She told herself she would not think of him. She thought of him for 6 days. On the 7th he came to Ravensmere. Enberfi, not as a suitor, which would have given her a shape to refuse, but on a matter of property, for the brook that fed his leased lodge ran first through her northern wood, and a fallen oak had dammed it, and he had come, he said, to ask leave to clear it. He stood in her morning room in the same plain coat, dried now, and he did not fill the silence with flattery as other men did, and he did not look about at the wealth of the house with the calculating warmth she had learned to despise. He looked at the portrait of her father above the cold hearth, the old Duke painted in his prime, with his hand on a globe, and he was quiet a moment. And then he said that he supposed it was a difficult thing to be the only soft place left in a house built by a man who permitted none. He did not look at her when he said it. He was looking at the painting. Yet Cassandra felt the sentence go through her as though he had reached past every wall she owned and laid one finger precisely on the wound, and she answered him sharply, because sharpness was the only language her grief had ever been allowed to speak. He took her sharpness without flinching. That was the first thing she learned about Nathaniel, that he was a man weather had made unbreakable in small social ways, that her coldness broke against him like rain against the side of a hill and ran off and left him standing. Other men met her sharpness with one of 2 faces. There was the wounded face which made her cruelty into their tragedy, and required her to apologize for having been provoked. And there was the contemptuous face which had been waiting all along for her to confirm what it already believed, and was almost grateful for the excuse, true or neither. He looked at her the way a man looks at a sea that has turned rough, with a kind of patient attention, as though her temper were weather to be read rather than an insult to be answered. And he simply waited for it to pass. And it passed, and he was still standing there when it had, which unsettled her more than any answer could have. He asked his leave for the brook. She granted it, ungraciously. He thanked her, and bowed, and at the door he paused, and said that the wood was very fine, and that she ought to walk in it sometime, since it belonged to her, and there was no one left to tell her she might not. Then he was gone, and she stood in the morning room a long while, and at last she went and walked in her own wood for the first time since her father's death, and did not entirely understand why her face was wet. The county, of course, noticed everything. A naval captain of no fortune calling at Ravensmere was precisely the kind of event the autumn had been starving for, and within a fortnight it had been examined from every angle and found alarming. Lady Henthorne was particularly alarmed. A penniless adventurer with no people in a leased lodge was exactly the sort of man who might attach himself to a wealthy woman alone, and she said as much, repeatedly to Cassandra's face. Under the guise of concern on a morning call she had not been invited to make, she sat in the drawing-room with her gloves still on, and explained that the captain was a fortune hunter, that everyone said so, that a woman of Cassandra's reputation could not afford the further ruin of being seen to encourage him, and that the kindest thing, the safest thing, would be to receive dear Crispin instead. Who wanted nothing she had not already. Cassandra listened with the still, cold face that had earned her name. Inside, where no one could see, she was turning the word fortune hunter over and over, and finding that it would not fit the man who had looked at her father's portrait and seen, in a single glance, the precise shape of her loneliness. Sigh. What no one in the county knew, what Cassandra herself would not learn for some weeks yet, was that Nathaniel had not come to that part of England by accident, and that the thing he carried was not greed, but grief, and that the two of them were more alike than either had the courage yet to say. It came out slowly, the way the truest things do in the long autumn afternoons that propriety could not quite prevent. He cleared the oak from the brook, and then, because the wood needed it, he stayed to clear the rest, and Cassandra found reasons to ride that way, and a friendship that neither would have named grew up between them in the cold, bright air, among the bare trees. She brought him things at first, under the pretext of stewardship, and then under no pretext at all. A flask of hot cider on the cold mornings, a loaf the cook had overbaked, once a book she had finished and thought he might like, and she had watched him turn it over in his scarred hands, with a care that told her books had been scarce in his life, and she had gone home and chosen another. He spoke little of himself, yet the wood was a confessional of a kind, and one gray afternoon when she asked him why a man with the sea in his blood had chosen to bury himself in an inland county, he stopped working, and was still for a long moment, his hands resting on the axe, and he told her. He had a wife once. Her name had been Eleanor. She had waited for him through 4 voyages, and on the 5th he had been delayed by a fortnight at a foreign port, chasing a better cargo and a better price. 2 weeks he had spent on greed he could not now remember the shape of. Quote, and in those 2 weeks a fever had come through the town where she waited, and she had died alone with his name on her letters. And no answer coming, he had made his fortune on that voyage. He had come home to a grave and a fortune he could not bear to touch. He had given most of it away and taken a lease in the quietest county he could find. To learn, he said, how to be a man who was not always somewhere else when he was needed. He told her all of this without self-pity, in the level voice of a man reading a ledger he had long since balanced and found himself permanently in debt. He named his wife only once. And he did not say it again, but Cassandra heard how the single saying of it had cost him, and she understood, standing among her own bare trees, that she had met the only other person in the county who knew what it was to live inside a house that grief had built. There had been one moment, in the telling, when he had stopped. He had been speaking steadily, the axe at rest, his eyes on the middle distance where the brook ran clear again, and when he came to the part about the letters that had gone on arriving at the foreign port after she was already 3 weeks in the ground, each one full of small, patient news and his name written in her hand. His voice had simply stopped working. He had stood there with his jaw set hard, mastering it the way she had spent her life, mastering things, and she had watched a man do in the open wood exactly what she did behind every closed door of her life, and she had felt the recognition go through her like cold water. She did not offer him comfort. She knew better than anyone how comfort lands on such a wound, like a hand on a burn. She said only that she was sorry he had been so long alone, and he looked at her, and something passed between them in the cold air that neither of them dared yet to call by its name. After that, the visits had a different weight. He began to issue her small instructions, the way he had once commanded a deck, and she discovered that beneath her irritation she did not entirely mind them. "Come out of the rain," he would say when she lingered too long at a gate. "Eat something," he said once, finding her pale, and produced an apple from his coat with the gravity of a man delivering dispatches. "Sit down," he told her. The afternoon she had ridden out with a fever she would not admit to, and she had been too tired to argue and had sat on a fallen log while he built a small fire, with the unhurried competence of a man who had built fires in worse weather than this. And she had watched his scarred hands among the kindling, and felt the strangest thing she had felt in years, which was safe. He had not made a fuss of it. He had not asked whether she was unwell, which would have required her to deny it, nor told her she looked unwell, which would have required her to bristle. He had simply looked at her once, read the flush and the brightness of her eyes the way he read the weather, and set about making a fire, as though the wood had always been a place where one stopped to warm oneself. He took off his own coat, the single good coat, and put it about her shoulders before she could refuse it, and the weight of it settled on her like a hand, and it smelled of wood smoke and salt and rain, and she sat inside the warmth of it, and did not give it back. He crouched on his heels across the small fire from her and fed it slowly, and did not speak, and the not speaking was its own kind of care, a silence held open for her to rest inside, and she understood that he had learned on long voyages among rough men that there were people you tended by leaving them alone in your company. She did not have a word for what he was doing. She knew only that every command was a door held open, and that no one had held a door for her since her father died. There was a child at the lodge. She learned not his. A boy of perhaps 7 named Tom, the orphaned son of a sailor who had served under Crewe and died at sea, whom Crewe had simply taken in, the way he had taken in the lease and the wood, and she was beginning to fear herself. She came upon them one afternoon without meaning to, riding quietly through the wood, and she reined in among the trees before they saw her, and she watched. The boy had a kite that would not fly, and he was near to tears with the frustration of it, and Crew knelt in the cold mud in his only good coat and showed him, patiently, again and again, how to feel the wind and let the string run, and when at last the kite rose, the boy shouted with a joy so pure, and the hard-scarred man laughed up at it with his whole ruined face open, and Cassandra, hidden among the trees, pressed her gloved hand to her mouth. She had seen by then a great many men perform kindness. The county was full of men who were generous when generosity could be witnessed and counted, who tousled the child's hair when a mother was watching, and forgot the child the moment she looked away. This was not that. There was no one to count it. The boy was nobody, the son of a dead sailor with nothing to give and no one to be impressed, and Crew knelt in the mud and ruined his coat and spent his patience on the small flying of a paper kite as though it were the most worthwhile work in the world, because to him, in that moment, it was. She watched him steady, the boy's hands on the string. She watched him point up at the kite and say something that made the boy's whole face open like his own, and she understood that she was looking at the thing itself, the genuine article kindness, with no audience and no profit, and that she had not known until that moment how starved she had been for the simple sight of it. She had thought him kind to her out of pity, or out of the strange courage of a man with nothing to lose. Watching him with the boy, she understood she had been wrong about the most important thing. He was not kind, because he had decided to be kind, to the dragon of Ravensmere. He was simply kind, all the way down, in the unwitnessed places where kindness costs and earns nothing, and the county that had named her had not the smallest idea what manner of man had come among them, any more than it had ever known what manner of woman she was. She turned her horse and rode home without letting them see her. And that night, she did not sleep, and she understood at last, with a kind of terror, that she had begun to love him, and that loving anyone was the one thing she had spent her whole life learning not to do. She woke the next morning resolved to end it. Loving him could only ruin him. The county would say she had trapped a penniless captain, or that he had trapped a friendless heiress. And either way, the small, clean thing growing in her northern wood would be dragged out into the open and made filthy, and she would not let that happen to a man who had finally taught himself how to stay. So when he came on the Thursday, as he had taken to doing, she met him with all the old coldness, the dragon entire, and she told him that the wood was clear now and the brook was running, and there was no further need for his visits, and that she thought it best for both their sakes that he did not call again. She watched the words, land. She watched his weathered face go still, in a way she had not seen before, the stillness of a man taking a wound, standing up, and he was quiet a moment, and then he said only that he understood, and bowed, and left. He had not argued, which was the part she had not prepared for. She had armed herself against persuasion, against the wounded face and the contemptuous face, and every weapon a man might bring against a woman's no, and he had brought none of them. He had looked at her for a long moment with something in his dark eyes that she would spend the night trying not to name, and then he had accepted her word as though it were a true thing she had a right to speak, which was the one response that could undo her. And he had taken up his hat and gone out into the gray afternoon without once asking her to take it back. She had done it perfectly. She had been magnificently cold. She went up to her room and was sick, and then she sat at the window and watched the empty drive until it was too dark to see, and somewhere in the long watching, she understood that she had not protected him at all. She had only protected the dragon. She had reached in the moment of her greatest fear for the one weapon her father had left her, and she had used it on the single person who had ever refused to be frightened by it. And the wood was clear now, and the brook was running, and she was alone in the house grief had built, exactly as she had always been taught she deserved to be. The county, sensing weakness, closed in. Lady Henthorne had not spent a season, laying siege to Ravensmere to let it slip now, and with the inconvenient captain dismissed, she pressed her advantage with the full machinery of her influence. There was to be a great dinner at Henthorne Court, the largest of the autumn, and Cassandra was invited in terms that made refusal a public insult, and it was understood, in the way the county understood things without saying them, that the dinner was to be the scene of an announcement that Crispin would offer for her before 30 witnesses, and that a woman in her position, friendless and slandered and alone, would not have the standing to refuse him without confirming every cruel thing the county believed. It was a trap, built of pure social pressure, and it was beautifully made, and Cassandra saw every wire of it and could find no way out that did not cost her the estate her father had bled to build, or the reputation that was the last thing she owned. She went to the dinner because there was no version of not going that did not make things worse. She wore gray, as she always did, among women dressed like the inside of jewel boxes, and she took her place at the long table beneath the blaze of the chandeliers, and she felt the whole room watching her, the way a wood watches a snared thing. The table seated 30, and every place was filled, and the candlelight came down off the great chandeliers, in a steady golden fall that left nowhere to hide. She had been seated, she noted, beside Crispin, with Lady Henthorne directly across, an arrangement no accident of precedence could explain. The talk moved around her in its practiced eddies, the weather and the hunting, and a marriage in the next county, and beneath it ran the other conversation, the one carried in glances, in the small turn of a head toward her, and away in the particular brightness of people who have come to watch something happen to someone else. She ate almost nothing. She answered when she was addressed in the cold, even voice that had earned her her name, and she felt the trap drawing closed around her one polished course at a time, and she could not for the life of her see the gap in it. Lady Henthorne was radiant with imminent victory. Crispin sat sweating in his good coat, glancing at his mother for his cues like a boy in a play he has not been given time to learn. And when the covers were removed and the moment came, Lady Henthorne rose with her glass and began, in honeyed tones, to speak of how pleased the county would be to see the troubles of poor Ravensmere settled at last, of how a difficult young woman might yet be brought to safe harbor by a patient family. And Cassandra understood that the announcement was upon her, that in a moment Crispin would be made to stand, and that she would be required to accept him or be destroyed. It was at that moment, before the question could be put, that the doors at the end of the long room opened, and Captain Nathaniel Crewe walked in out of the rain. He had not been invited. He had no card, no standing, no fortune to make him welcome at that table, and he walked the length of the room in his plain dark coat, with the rainwater bright on his shoulders, while 30 faces turned to follow him, the chandeliers blazed down, and Lady Henthorne's honeyed sentence died in her throat. He did not hurry. He had crossed 3 oceans, and he crossed Lady Henthorne's dining room as though it were the smallest water he had ever traversed, and he came to the place where Cassandra sat, frozen among her enemies, and he stopped, and he looked down at her with his whole broken face, open the way it had been open to the boy and the kite, and the room held its breath. Lady Henthorne found her voice. She demanded to know the meaning of this intrusion, who had admitted him, what a person of his sort imagined he was doing at her table. And Crewe did not so much as glance at her. He kept his dark eyes on Cassandra, and he said, in the level voice that had ordered men through storms, that he had let a foolish pride send him away once, that he had spent a fortnight too long, away from someone who needed him once before and had buried her for it, and that he had sworn over that grave never to be late again. Then he held out his scarred hand to her, palm up, in front of all of them, and he said the only words that mattered. "Marry me, Cassandra. Let them say what they like." The room made no sound at all. It was 11 words, and they were not poetry, and they cited nothing but the plain, irreversible fact of a man choosing a woman in the one place the county had gathered to dispose of her. Cassandra looked at the open hand, scarred and steady, and held out over the white cloth and the blazing silver, and she looked at the face above it, and she felt 23 years of armor she had been taught to call herself cracked straight down the middle. She did not stand at once. The body knew before the mind permitted, the way it always had with him. And she felt her own hand rise from her lap, as though it belonged to someone braver than she had ever been allowed to be, and she put it into his, scarred palm to gloved palm, and the warmth of it went up her arm and into the cold rooms of her where no warmth had reached in years. She stood. She heard distantly Lady Henthorne begin to fragment, the polished sentences coming apart into pieces. Fortune hunter and disgrace, and you cannot, and think of your father. And she found that none of the pieces could reach her anymore. She looked at the woman who had named her a dragon before 40 witnesses. And she felt no triumph, only a great and sudden tiredness with the whole long game of it. She said quietly that she was grateful to Lady Henthorne for her many months of concern, and that she would trouble her with it no further. Then she walked the length of the long, bright room with her hand in Nathaniel's past the staring faces and the dying candles and Crispin half risen and forgotten in his chair, and out through the great doors into the clean, cold rain. And the dragon of Ravensmere did not look back once. They were married quietly, in the small church at the edge of her own land 6 weeks later, with the boy Tom carrying the ring on a cushion and grinning so hard his face threatened to split, and the housekeeper weeping into her apron, and almost no one else because almost no one else was wanted. The county had a great deal to say about it for a while, and then, as counties do, it found something newer to say. And the saying moved on and left them alone, which was all either of them had ever wished for. There was a particular afternoon that winter that Cassandra kept for herself, after the way one keeps a pressed flower. The first true snow had come, and it fell past the windows of the morning room at Ravensmere in great slow feathers, and the fire was lit, and her father's portrait still hung above the hearth with his hand on his globe. But the room beneath it was no longer cold. The house had changed by small degrees, so gradually that she could not have named the day it became a home. There were boots in the hall that were not hers. There was the smell of wood smoke that followed Nathaniel everywhere and had got into the curtains, now into the very stone of the place. There was a dog the boy had found half-starved in the lane and brought home and named, with a sailor's logic, Anchor, and that lay now across the threshold of the morning room, with one ear cocked toward the rug. Tom lay on the rug with a wooden boat Nathaniel had carved him, sailing it across imaginary oceans toward the fender. Nathaniel sat in the chair that had been her father's, and did not seem to find it strange to sit there, mending the kite string with his scarred, patient hands. And Cassandra stood at the window with her own hands spread flat against the cold glass, watching the snow bury her wood, where a stranger had once told her she might walk, because it belonged to her, and there was no one left to forbid it. She thought of the word the county had given her, dragon, and found it had lost all its teeth. It was only a word. She saw now a thing the frightened had made to explain a woman they had never troubled to know. She thought of her father, who had built her a fortress and never learned the way out of it, and she hoped, wherever he was, that he could see the fire lit, and the boy on the rug, and the man in his chair, and understand at last that the soft place he had tried so hard to harden in her had survived him, after all, had survived everything, had only ever been waiting for someone to cross a crowded room and refuse, on her behalf, to look away. Nathaniel looked up from the kite string and found her watching him, and the corner of his broken mouth moved in the small, rare way she had learned to read as joy. "Come and sit by the fire," he said in the level voice that had once sounded to her like a command, and that she knew now for what it had always been, a door held open. And she did. The snow went on falling past the window, soft and endless and kind, and somewhere in the warm, bright room, a boy laughed at a boat that would never reach the sea, and a woman who had spent her whole life learning to need nothing sat down at last beside the one thing she had been brave enough to want. If you have stayed with Cassandra all the way to this fire, perhaps you will tell me, in a quiet word, which moment you carried away. The wood is hers, the door stands open, and the snow keeps falling, the way it always does, at the end of the long, cold story, on a house that has finally learned to be warm.